Today, I'd like to talk about something that was in the news recently, which was about Chinese graduate students who went home to China, probably most of them for spring holiday, to connect with their families and then return to the US. And even though they had valid visas, they were rejected by US Border Patrol and sent back to China. It's at one level a little story in the sense that its macro impact is not big. On the other hand, it's a painful human story. What the US is doing in this space is not serious. So we take your average everyday border patrol individual who, on their own judgment, knowing very little about American security, knowing nothing about what the student's actually doing, and you have them interrogate the student for like 4 to 5 hours. And then, in your judgment, again, knowing very little about what the student actually does, and even less about the national security issue, you and you alone make a judgment on whether they're a threat. It's kind of a farce when you think about it. So let me focus on the big issue. Is one of the two countries, US and China, going to emerge with a clear leadership position in advanced technologies? Let's start with the US. The US has, by a pretty big margin, the strongest university system in the world. So when you look at annual rankings of the top universities around the world, the US universities, undergrads totally dominate. If you look at graduate schools, the US dominates even more because the degree of specialization that's possible. So, a huge advantage for the US is the quality of the graduate schools that are up and running and have been so for 100 plus years. The second major advantage the US has is it spends an enormous amount of money on its defense budget each year, which obviously is very tied up in the security issue. If you look at the third and final advantage the US has, there are a number of very sophisticated areas of advanced technologies where the US has a pretty clear lead and it's going to be difficult for China to catch up. So let's switch over to China and say, what are China's advantages? To me, the biggest advantage that China has is the effectiveness of its industrial policies. So when China sits down and basically sets a priority for the next 10 to 20 years, so let's use electric vehicles as an example. They are able to access the most talented people on that subject in China and make incredible progress in a relatively short period of time. China had virtually no automobile industry 12 to 14 years ago. Today, China dominates EVs, dominates batteries, and accounts for the sale of more than half of all EVs globally. The second big advantage that China has is its education system. China has always, going back to Confucian values, put an enormous premium and expectation on every individual that they will work hard to get ahead, not for their own benefit, but for their family and for the country. And you see that in terms of how disciplined and how hardworking Chinese students are. The final advantage that China has is it has no interest in taking over other countries. It's very committed to the reunification of Taiwan for all the obvious historic reasons. But China spends almost no money literally trying to take over, occupy, and shape the future of other countries and other nationalities. If you compare that with the US, which has spent trillions of dollars in wars that added no value in terms of outcome and produced enormous human suffering. So I'm talking about Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Syria, etc. So when you step back from the advantages on the US side and the advantages on the China side, and think about how head-to-head competitive they are, my sense is they're going to be relatively close near term in this space.